Hey everybody, welcome to today's BAInsights session. As you can see, I'm really pleased to have two guests with me live, which is very unusual for these sessions, but very apt as well. We're in London and we're talking about the future of business analysis and the development of the BA skill set. And I've got two really perfect people to come along and join us in that conversation. Before we get into that, and before we get into some of the questions, I wonder if I can ask my guests. Let's start with you first, Delvin, perhaps, just to introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here. My name is Delvin Fletcher, and I have the privilege of being the president of IIBA globally, and happen to work out to be with you in London. So it's a wonderful opportunity to chat.
How you doing?
Hi, everyone. I'm Andy Grazebrook. I'm the partner program manager for IIBA in the European region, based in London in the UK, and work across all of our partners in Europe, countries in Europe. So thanks for having me.
Very nice to have people from the IIBA. Most of the time we have people who are volunteering for the IIBA, or people talking about good events that you do for different chapters. So it's definitely both nice to have you both with us, gents. So I'm going to keep it easy with the nice simple questions, as we said before, to kick things off. And I wonder if you could tell me, I'll start with you, perhaps Delvin, on this one first, how you see the role, or how you and the IIBA see the role of the business analyst evolving over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, so we're starting with an easy question, John. Thanks for that. Let me make maybe a couple of comments. First of all, we really see IIBA as kind of the curator of the profession, not the guru of what's going to happen. So we're not sitting in our ivory tower thinking deep thoughts about what the future looks like. What we're trying to do is understand what our community are, with this large ecosystem of partners and members all over the world. And a lot of our work is trying to understand where they are going with their work and what they believe the answer to those kinds of questions are. So I think, in that context, I think the future of business analysis, from what I see and talking to all kinds of different people around the world, is varied. It's vibrant. It has lots and lots of opportunity. Obviously, we're going to probably end up talking about the influence of AI in some of this, but I think even independent of the influence of AI, what we are seeing is all kinds of business analysis roles across all types of organizations, all sizes, all kinds of work. And we also at times sometimes make a distinction a little bit between business analysis as a skill set and business analyst as a role. It's kind of interesting to think about that, actually, because our founders 20 years ago, long before I got involved with IIBA, they chose business analysis as the kind of working definition of the profession. Not the business analyst role per se, although obviously there's big connection between the two. And I think there was some interesting foresight there, right? Thinking about the fact that it plays itself out in all kinds of roles, of which, of course, business analyst is probably the most primarily understood, but it's not the only one. We see business analysis in all kinds of places. In fact, in the last member survey that we did, there were 425 job titles inside our membership of the respondents, right? Now, obviously, the number one was business analyst and the number two was senior business analyst, but then you had this broad distribution of names. So I think from a role standpoint, we're probably going to see some change and some evolution. I think from a skill standpoint, we're going to see continued demand across all kinds of opportunities in the workplace.
Yeah, good. Andy, any points from you?
Well, in terms of working on the ground with communities of business analysts within the partner companies and the universities and things that I work with, it's quite interesting to kind of build on some of the points Delvin's made about the definition of who those people are, and also within organizations sometimes how they find each other. So as defined against other roles that you might think of, there's rarely a business analysis department where you find all the business analysts grouped together, meeting in an office together every day. So a lot of the work I'm doing is trying to sort of work with the community that's maintained, and we do this with your company, to bring them together to have, they will often have a organised communication, regular meetings, check-ins, and I'm trying to connect those to see where they're aware of IBA kind of material and things that could be supporting to them. But also to hear back. I mean, that many of these questions, the answers I'm seeking are coming from the community I'm not providing them necessarily to them, but I'm interested to know from those different stakeholders what their view on these questions are quite often.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting as well. I mean, the role that the IIBA are playing is, I think, for me, like the way that I've seen business analysis evolve over even just the last few years is really that connectedness of different BAs, wherever they are in an organisation or a team, or actually the globe as well. You know, and I think as many opportunities there are to connect people within their own regions, their own teams, but more wider, can only be promoted. I think the more BAs probably recognise that, the more they might reach out themselves and try and join some of the dots in their own way. But I know it's not always easy. Maybe the chapters and the events that the IIBA do, and there are obviously other organisations that do similar, but any of those dots that can be joined up is always.
Yes, it is. And I think that you're absolutely right that that part of the ecosystem is so important going forward, partly because I think maybe unlike other professions that, business analysis as sort of a semi-organized profession is pretty young compared to others, So if you think about it, say, compared to medicine, medicine's been around for 250 years. As an organized profession, there's a fairly defined set of pathways in terms of how you get into the profession, what your baseline skills need to be. Obviously, people end up being specialized and doing other things as they mature in their career, but you've got this huge pedigree of almost an accepted path that exists pretty much, right? And I think in our profession, because we're much younger and we're very distributed inside organizations, those paths are not as, perfectly defined. They don't have a century of history behind them. So part of what that means is we need to stay connected to each other to learn, right? Because there are organizations in the world that have very established sort of business analysis practices that are centralized inside their organizational design. And there's other organizations that choose deliberately not to do it that way, right? And I don't think there's a right answer for that work. I think that a lot of it depends on the context and the kind of work that's being done inside the organization.
Yeah, I mean, that takes us nicely on to another question, actually, in terms of how you believe or see the profession is keeping pace with the pace of and the change of business and technology. Another simple one.
Yes, we're keeping them nice and easy today. So I think that there's probably a yes and a no answer to that question. Because if you think about it, business analysis in some ways is a profession of skills, of technique, of context, of at times method, or at least the work that supports method. And of course, that gets us into all kinds of emotionally debated territory, right? My method versus your method, those kinds of things. And I think that one of the things that I've always found helpful in our profession is that if we're doing our work well, I think we are supporting framework, we're supporting method, we're supporting competency centers, we're supporting project management offices, we're supporting software development enterprises, whatever they might look like. But we're not in the fray of the debate about whether my method is better than your method. And I think when we're doing our best work, we stay as a skilled partner in that work, as opposed to sort of the leaders of whether one thing is better than the other, because those things continue to change, right? Yeah. And they've been evolving, especially in the last 20, 30 years, right? And I think when we're doing our best work, we're looking at what does that framework, what is that organizational context, what does that project need in terms of skills, and how can we contribute? So I think that's probably why there's probably a yes, no answer to your question. Yeah. But when we're doing that well, the answer is yes. Our skills are relevant. And in fact, we need broad skills so that we can adapt them to the context in which we're operating. And that might be different next week than it is today, depending on the organizational context. I think when we're not at our best, we get involved in the method wars. We get involved in the fights about whether it's agile or waterfall in context of an organizational piece of work, historically, or whatever the new versions of that are going to be, some of which, of course, will be influenced by AI technique and AI influence on organizations and things like that.
Yeah, it is an interesting point, though, because I think, certainly from my experience at the IIBA, it's very much, that there's opportunity for people to learn about different techniques as an example, but you're not telling people this is the only way that you need to approach a situation, or this is how you must use this technique in every situation. There's no grey areas. So I think that's quite good because it shows that there are many ways to approach a situation. And that, as you say, that partnership means that you're in that position to evolve as you see the profession evolving and business around evolving, and actually those peripheral professions, because it's no good BA evolving in one direction. Your project managers are involved in a completely different way, or developers. So,
and if you think about your point, John, that requires in some ways more skill. It's relatively easy for me to just acquire deep knowledge of one framework, let's say, if I work at it hard enough, right? And become an expert in that framework or that, methodological construct, whatever it might be, right? The problem with that, of course, is when something changes. My leadership changes, my organizational context changes, my focus changes. Some external force comes into the company that I'm working for, and all of a sudden we have to change. We have a new competitor, we have a crisis, we have something, right? I think that rigidity has become a problem in a lot of things in the world, and where I really see business analysis at its best is when there's a breadth of knowledge that has that kind of agility, small a agility, sensing and responding to change sitting in the background, so that I've got a set of skills, a portfolio of skills that I can bring to bear on the work context in which I'm operating, right? Because, as we all know, the one thing that is kind of constant is things will change. I don't know any organization in the last 20 years that has done exactly the same thing, and right, in terms of how it does its work internally. And I think that's more work. It takes more skill, it takes more effort, it takes more investment to have that kind of roundedness, so that I can, use one set of techniques today in the context that say you want me to work in, and then a month from now I'm moving into a different kind of opportunity, and I need a different set of techniques that I'm bringing to bear. And I think that's a simple model of when I really do think we are doing our best work.
Yeah, no, I agree. It does make me think as well about the way that the BA role has evolved from my perspective over the last 20 or so years, in terms of maybe 20 years ago, BAs would just do business analysis. Now, people are doing business analysis, they're doing project management, they're doing consulting, they're doing loads of other things that are all connected as well. And they don't always need just business analysis guidance. They need that to support the guidance they're getting regarding project management and data, for my simple example as well. I wonder, Andy, is there anything that you might add to that?
Well, it was just occurring to me because the question at the top was about the difference with an international kind of coverage, and I think that's kind of an interesting way of looking at how things might be nuancedly different from one country to the next. And I think that all of our work is with a bit of an international perspective in mind.
Yeah.
So you've worked, I know, with the chapters. We have a really strong chapter in the UK, for example, that holds events, has some programs and things. But we also have another 110-ish chapters around the world, each who do sort of similar work. And, obviously that kind of offers an opportunity for us to hear sometimes similar topic from the perspective of another kind of geographic region and market, or maybe some sort of slightly different topics coming out from those different communities. And that's the power of kind of working on an international basis, is that we kind of then can learn from all of those different approaches as a membership. Obviously, IIBA members, they can access all of those events if they're based in the UK. They can still hear about stuff in other countries too. So I think it offers quite an interesting view on how things might be able to find one place to the other, as one example.
That cross-pollination, as it were, between different chapters, I think is quite powerful. I have the benefit of seeing it through some of the BA insight sessions that we have. For example, like they wanted someone in the Tampa Bay chapter, and it's other part of the conversation, there might be someone else as well from, say, the South Africa chapter, just to name a couple of examples. Yeah. And hearing their perspectives on a similar topic is interesting, because you can say it reaffirms sometimes that there are some fundamentals that they both apply, no matter where they're based. But then they do have some nuances, based on maybe the culture of those regions, or the industries that are predominant in those areas, or the organisations that their members work in. And it's really interesting to sort of hear the different views that are coming out. But I think what's also interesting is that some of those underlying fundamental, I don't know if I want to call it values or traits of a business analyst, but you know, that curiosity and that connectedness and that openness as well, seem to be kind of universal, I think, no matter where what chapters I've been fortunate to enough to engage with anyone.
I think you're right. And I think if there's one benefit that we can see coming out of the pandemic, it was that it forced us to think in a little bit more of a global virtual sense because we had no choice for a season. You know, and one of the things that we decided to do operationally in 2021 or 2022 was kind of reframe membership a little bit so that a member can actually choose any chapter they want to be part of. Not obviously we logically assume that it's going to be more comfortable to choose the one that they're most geographically connected to. But about a third of IIBA's members globally aren't really anywhere close to a physical chapter. Because the communities are too small, or there isn't yet a chapter in their particular country. And part of what that did is it opened up this kind of virtual connection. And we did a bit of work on the technology side to make that more accessible and more common around the world. And so we that kind of cross-fertilization of learning and ideas, I think it was always in our ethos as a profession, but it got really accelerated over the last 2 years, partly because we didn't have choice and everybody was sitting staring at screens, because as we were all sort of locked down in various countries. But I think that's healthy for the long term too, exactly what your point is, because now we've got this ability to dial into a community that's much bigger than our particular setting locally, even though there's obviously lots of benefit to sitting across the table with a cup of coffee from somebody that's practicing in the same way that you are, because you're going to learn a lot there too.
And that's right. It's nice to see that balance. At least now you've got that option, I guess. Whereas you see in the Ireland chapter, they're doing sessions really effective and impactful and valuable. You don't necessarily have to try and recreate that in every chapter. We can invite other chapters or people, other chapters to come along to that.
Some of that's matched with the organisations we're working with. They're not all one country organisations either necessarily. Work with a lot of companies, for example, who are international and have offices in multiple different locations. So those different perspectives are built into their day-to-day. So it's great to think that we have a local relevance occasionally in those different areas that they can tap into, and their membership might be spread in those different countries as well, so they can have the locally relevant and then the other perspective from other regions too.
We're on the theme of learning and skills. And are there any skills that you believe, or the IIBA believe, are non-negotiable or will be non-negotiable in business analysis over the next decade?
Another easy question, but yes, I do. I think that there are a few. I don't know that they're necessarily new skills, but I think they are skills that will have increased weight in the era that lies ahead of us. I think data, it's sometimes we call data literacy, which is probably a very broad term that can mean all kinds of things, but data understanding, I think, is going to become even more critical in the years ahead. I think it's always been critical, and I think but I think that one of the 3 or 4 major things that AI brings to our work going forward is the need to understand the underlying architecture of data, and that can mean a whole lot of different things. It can mean how that large language model is trained. It can mean what the lineage is of the data set that I'm working with to do something. It can mean whether I understand even the ethics and the fit of the data set that I'm working with. And I think one of the skills that's going to be imperative for all of us going forward is to have an understanding of the underlying kind of the data, not the data set we're dealing with, but really the data foundation that informs our work, because that's always been true. But because the AI world is going to accelerate the ability to do some of those development tasks, programming tasks, even the speed with which we can go from input to output, which of course is changing radically in a lot of areas. But what that means is that the quality of the input to output path is going to be heavily influenced by what all of those data elements are that are sitting inside all the work that we're part of, depending on whatever role we may have.
That's right. And actually through AI generally as well, it brings data to the fore, makes it a bit more accessible for BAs, perhaps. Because certainly recall back in the day, I'm going to call it that rather than give it a date. If I wanted to know, what data related to a loan transaction, as an example, I would have to go and speak to the loans business team. I'd have to go and speak to the development team. I'd have to then go and maybe look at some tables and to validate it. Whereas at least now I can use AI and Gemini to maybe get that contextual understanding first, and maybe to help me think about some of the wider questions that I might need to ask, rather than potentially go backwards and forwards as I would have done in the past.
Yeah. And now you have both a speed opportunity to do certain things massively faster than you used to on that kind of point, but also an imperative of, I don't know what the new term is going to be for this, but let's call it sort of an imperative of understanding to say, is the model that I'm using to surface that analysis instantly right now built in such a way that I can rely on what it's doing ethically, for example, or is it actually rendering for me what I need to know in that particular circumstance, or do I have to work on that kind of work? And I think that's that sort of data sensitivity, that data foundation work is going to become super important in our work going forward, because the critical path of the work itself, of course, is also changing, and so depending on the sector you talk about, so it's already changed, right?
Yeah, and it's quite interesting as well. I mean, to think about, we just take data as the example. It's probably easy to think about data and AI being on the horizon of things we definitely need to learn about, but probably easy as well to forget about those softer skills, those skills that enable us to interact still with the individuals that are going to be part of the work. They might be part of the work in a slightly different way now or in the future than they are today. We still need to be able to interact with people and be able to tease things out of them in a slightly different way, perhaps, than we would in the past. Yes. But Andy,
I think it's kind of interesting that how it highlights the continued importance for that business analysis function in a more and more automated process, right? So we've got the things that Delvin's talked about in terms of these skills of understanding what the data is, where it's come from, all of that kind of information. I mean, a lot of the fears around more automation bring up discussion all over the press and things about accuracy of data hallucination, bias, and those sorts of things. And I feel like the business analysis person is kind of standing in a very good place to notice these things and sort of raise the need to check again on something, or look at how some of this information has come out of automated systems and things like that. Perhaps looking at where data is feeding in as well, and the good practice around those things. So I think in terms of, it feels like the role is all the more important as things develop into the future. I think it's the IIBA perspective on it, as you might expect, but I think there's good reasons for that.
Interesting as well to think about, like data hallucinations as an example, as a new phenomenon because of AI. But it's not really. It's just a different provider of a data hallucination. Before it would have been, we speak to one stakeholder and they have a misinterpret the data they get based on a perspective. That's arguably a data hallucination in a slightly different way. Yeah. I mean, in the past, the BA Skillset has allowed us to mitigate that by speaking to other perspectives, or to looking into different sources, or to watch the process be enacted. So we can determine there is a data hallucination in that case. And very much now, when we use AI and we use Gemini, if we get information from that, we don't trust it as the only credible source. We evaluate it.
And I think you raise a really important point in probably two parts to your point about hallucination. And there's nothing new there. But what is changing is the pace at which we can do some of that work. And the pace becomes both a problem and an opportunity, I think, at the same time. Because obviously there's opportunity to do things fast, but in some ways, scary fast. Yeah. Because I, snap my fingers and it's done, so to speak. But that also creates, I think, challenges that business analysis can speak into really, really powerful, which is part of it is, are we moving too fast? In other words, do we have enough of a foundation of understanding of whatever problem we're trying to solve here right now, or whatever AI tool we're implementing to help us be more productive? Because productivity in and of itself is dangerous unless we know that we're moving to a place where we have a solution, where we have something that we can render to whatever leadership context we're operating into and say, yes, this has enough quality that I can put my sort of professional name behind it and say, yes, John, I'm ready to deliver, right? And in 20 years ago, some parts of that moved more slowly, and we probably had more time to think about some of those issues. But if I could code instantly to very high technical quality, as I can now in lots of settings, then I don't have that. I can't do things in parallel to my code exercise anymore because it was done before I started. But now I have a different problem, which is, have I coded what I thought I was coding? Have I connected that stakeholder context to whatever my solution is? And I think those are the kinds of skills that are really going to be important going forward. And I've been kind of using this term, the pace of work, as an example. There might be a better way to think about it, right? But the in a lot of work contexts, the things that act as the gate to the critical path are now going to change, especially software, medical research, areas like that, certain process areas, because if I can automate them, particularly with AI tools, I can increase speed radically. But increasing speed in and of itself does not automatically get me a better output. And I think one of the biggest areas where we as a profession can help here is to be sort of the people that say, we're at the right pace or we're not. We need to slow down because this area is not yet solid enough. Maybe it's data, maybe it's something else, right? Or I think we're good. Let's roll and let's move quickly, and I think if we do either one, if we're only the people that slow things down, of course, that's not very productive. If we're only the people that allows particularly the automation elements of this to run at whatever speed they want to, that's also problematic, because at the end of the day, leaders are looking for people in their organizations who can tell them the truth in a situation, who can give them confidence in the next step, in the outcome, in the launch of the process or the product or the renewal or whatever the context might be, right? And I think those sort of skills are going to become really important.
Yeah, absolutely. You make a great point there around not just the pace, it's the control pace.
Yeah.
That organisations want, and BAs that can help provide that control. Yeah. In pace of change. Also, we'll start touching on balance as well to a degree there, and which is a nice segue I'm going to use anyway to the next question in terms of how BAs can balance their core analytical capabilities with emerging skills like AI fluency, but storytelling, systems thinking, and more broadly. I wonder, Andy, do you have a view on that?
Well, I mean, I think that when we discuss this a lot, we're quite clear that quite a lot of the business analysis skills that people have been acquiring for the last long time, a lot of them are still relevant. You mentioned earlier about a lot of the soft skills, which I feel are still really important in the process, even with the use of a lot of automation. I guess it makes sense that people in those roles will necessarily develop more skills in newer technologies, whether it's prompting of AI tools and different things like that, that make it kind of make it more possible for them to be part of that kind of technological side of the process. But I think, we also feel strongly, as I say, that, the business analysis skill that they have developed, that they are continuing to develop in that area, remains really important as part of the process. And if anything, is sort of fundamental to the correct evolution of implementation of these technologies.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's a resounding yes to your comments. Those skills are important. I think the depth of knowledge of the skill is going to vary depending on what kind of work you're doing and what context you're working in. But I think the future is going to cause us to all need more skills, at least at some level. But I also think I've been reading recently, I'm talking to a couple of people in the community who are kind of looking at skill design, particularly from a learning and development standpoint. And we all know kind of historically this idea of sort of the T skill, where I have a very broad knowledge of a whole lot of things, and then I kind of go deep in something very specific. I've been talking to a few people recently who are kind of saying it's not T anymore, it's N. It's this idea, there's some technical definitions to this that I'm not an expert in by any means, but this idea that I likely am going to need depth in a few areas. Because that's how I'm going to be able to mobilize in a more agile way, right, or a more nimble way, a more responsive way to the context in which I'm doing my work. So, I mean, there's some extreme examples of that. I may be an artist and a coder at the same time, but I think in business analysis, the principle still applies, which is depending on where I'm working and the kind of work I'm doing, there's going to be, I think, a lot of value for having 3 or 4 areas where I've got some depth to my skill set, because then I can pull those things together in a creative way, depending on what context I'm working in. And all of that, kind of almost becomes a resounding yes to not every skill on the planet, but any skill that can help me understand business context, business process, the data architecture inside what organizations are trying to do, the connection between inputs and outputs, between stakeholders and customers, and all of those kinds of things, which are all part of the language of our work. But they're all accelerating now because there's this illusion that I can do things much more quickly. And it's not just an illusion. There is a reality to that in the AI tool context, but I think that one of our biggest value propositions to the organizations we're working for is to be the people that are sort of trusted to help manage that work, how fast it can move, how analytical it can become, whether the data is right, whether we can put the tool in place and just press the go button, or whether we have more work to do, right? And I think those are the kinds of skills that organizational leaders are looking for inside the communities that most of us are working in.
Yeah, actually, I can relate to that. And I wish I could remember who it was who mentioned it on a previous BAInsights session, but they were referring to the fact that across your BA career, there's various instances in your time where you do go deep in very certain topics and not in others. But the depth changes as well, depending on the context.
Yeah.
And of course, for different BAs, that depth and the topic that they choose to go deep in will vary greatly. So it probably demonstrates that there's probably more value as well on the collective skill set of the team of BAs, rather than ensuring or trying to ensure that every single BA has all of the depth in all of the skill areas, because it's probably a little bit impractical that they're going to be able to get them. And even if they get them, how can they maintain that skill to a very great level of detail consistently?
And some of those are going to move through automation curves, particularly in the next 5 to 10 years, that are, even if they're not AI influenced, even if they're not AI driven, they're going to be AI influenced, right? I think we'll find ways of automating certain kinds of work that will be quite successful, and I think we're going to find ways of automating certain kinds of work that will be quite dangerous. And part of what we have to do, I think, is help the organizations we're working for navigate through that, and almost be I don't think we're the arbiter of what is right, but I do think we can be the influencer on what is mature enough, or what is reliable enough, or what is not hallucinating at a level that's going to create danger for whatever the context is we're working. Of course, that's going to vary widely. It's a whole lot of a different world if I'm coding a mobile app or involved in the design thinking or the customer satisfaction or the customer delivery of a mobile app, or if I'm working at renewing a process that has human lives that are dependent on how well it operates in healthcare or in government service or in things like that, right? And so I think the skills are going to have some commonality maybe in those two examples, but the way I apply those skills is going to be radically different.
I feel that that's why the conversation. I feel like we could go on talk about that for ages. I mean, certainly just the immediate thing that springs to mind when you're talking there is that just that ability for the BA to take a step back and ask why, and is that the right solution? Do you really need a solution? Is it better maybe in this one instance to do something a little bit more manual? And they're all questions that the BA doesn't need to know the answer to. They just need to know that it's right to ask that question. I wonder, we're sort of talking, that sort of feels like a bit of a move into mindset as well. Andy, I'll ask you this, in terms of mindset shifts, are there any that are needed for business analysts, you think, to remain relevant or influential in modern organizations, the modern world?
I think that, as I said, I think the business analysis mindset is an important one to include in the shift, right? So I'm sure there's ways that with new ways of business being done, with more automation being used, and all of that, but it might sort of proliferate in different ways. it's kind of similar to some of the skill levels we were talking about, right? So the speed, and then also, I guess, the volume that work might be tempted to move into because of these changes makes the BA again a kind of important checkpoint in that process. Someone that's aware of ethics, someone that's aware of where data might, be affected by, different influences, this sort of thing. So I think effectively, yeah, I'm sure there will be evolutions in the way that those skills kind of develop, but I think they will come from similar roots of kind of where they were born from in the first place. So.
I think maybe to build on what Andy said, I think we're going to see a couple of shifts. I think we actually already are seeing these shifts. One is deep skill is still important. And there's a lot of business analysis practitioners that have built their career on having a depth of knowledge in technique or skill, or even some areas directly connected to methodology or framework, that is still immensely valuable and going to be critical in some industries, some contexts, some kinds of work. But I think that there are also other practitioners where probably the mindset is we're all learning, and we're all there in a way. There's almost less, maybe less thought leaders and more thought learners. In other words, the imperative is how fast can we learn the skill set that we need in this situation. And it's probably not from zero if we've got some experience in our work. It's almost kind of calibrating what my knowledge and my depth of technique skill, and saying, here's how much I need in this situation, given the work I'm doing, given the automation impact or not. And then I need a different calibration of those same skills in a different context. Now I don't think that's new, but I think it's because I think good practice has always involved that kind of calibration of skill.
Yeah.
But I think the technology envelope that we're now working on means that the extremes of speed and pace and automation and use of technology make that skill set even more important, to know kind of how much I need in that particular moment. But if you think about it, it also means I need this idea of sort of, I've heard people talk about this idea of sort of holding method lightly. In other words, I need to hold method lightly means I've got to be very skilled at knowing how my work is going to contribute to whatever method I'm involved in. But it means I'm not so passionate about this method that I'm afraid to move away from it and embrace a different method or a hybrid method or a transition between methods. And I think if you think about that kind of concept, to do that well, I need to be constantly learning. I need to be constantly challenging my own skill set and trying to benefit from, people who are going deeper than I am, or have more experience than I, or have looked at whatever the sector might be to that, so that I can sort of pick and internalize elements of those pieces of knowledge or experience or wisdom or skill, and say, hey, here's what I'm going to do in my next example of that kind of work. And by the way, I don't think any of that's new, but I think it's kind of, we have a big spotlight on it now because there's a new set of tools in the mix. There's a higher degree of automation from technology that allows us to do this work.
Yeah.
And if we can do our work well, we can kind of we roll with those forces, right? Or that tide or whatever wave, whatever you want to call it, right? And I think really be relevant to the organizations that we're working with.
And it's interesting from a mindset perspective. Well, I think in that certain BAs, I think if they are very deep experts in a particular domain, that it's obvious that they don't need to necessarily step out of that domain, become cross-functional, become generalists, that actually they can build an additional set of skill sets that can allow them to be better or more efficient, or to ask different questions as their environments and domains are evolving. But maybe for some, actually that ability to look outside their domain, think more cross-functional, gives them the ability to identify new ways to apply or new methods, as it were, to apply to their existing practices, or an area of expertise or a certain way of questioning, to bring it into their current organisations as well. And maybe it's good that there's no definite black and white answer. Some have to look out, some have to look in. but just that general awareness that there are a number of different ways to learn is probably a good starting point.
And every BA is different as well, because they have a different career route. It's not always 100% of their job. I think we touched on this earlier, but actually it might be a combined discipline with other sort of job focuses, which might play into where those slight deep dive skill sets come from, right? Because of the other tasks and things that they're also trained in at the same time.
Yeah.
I think there are certainly those that do most of their time, and also in the wider community, we're finding people who use these skills part of their week, not necessarily as their entire responsibility. So that's going to make for a varied and diverse group of people.
And tool skill sets, a topic that a related set of topics that come up regularly in some BA conversations I have or insight sessions is around, how important it is for BAs to develop hands-on technical skills, really technical skills, I would say, such as, enabling them to work on low-code platforms. I know we've mentioned data analysis previously. Prompt engineering might be another example of that. Good to get your view on that.
I think business analysis is an ideal skill set for prompt engineering. I also think prompt engineering itself is going to evolve radically in the next 2 years. And I'm not sure 2 years from now what it's going to look like, because some of prompt engineering lends itself to massive new kind of disruptive automation itself, right? Mm-hmm. But I think at this point in time, in some ways, the business analysis skill set really lends itself to the architecture of prompt engineering, whether it's the technical skill itself, but I think at this right now it probably is. I think low code and other sort of fast coding techniques probably depends on context. I think obviously in some of the consultancy work and some software development, I think it also depends on the organizational context, because some organizations approach that with business analysis embedded in technical teams. Some organizations approach that with centers of excellence or communities of practice or office type functions where the business analysis skill set is acting as a service provider for the organization. I think the context there is going to matter a lot. I think in the coding context, though, we're starting to see some spotlight on certain other things. One is scenario testing and user acceptance testing, sort of, which has always oftentimes been the poor child of work, right? It was seen as, in some circles, as sort of the thing that the junior pedantic staff team reluctantly got roped into to kind of go and make sure that this app was actually working, right? I think it may be finding more of the moment, because if I now have a critical path that is instant, and I don't have latency in my process design from a code standpoint, I now have front end and back end work that is 100,000 times more important. And scenario design, test iterations, even code iterations are all going to change radically, because the latency of time I'm spending inside the code envelope is now going to be very different than it was 5-10 years ago. And in a lot of if you think about it, somebody said this to me recently, that we forget that the classic software development lifecycle, however it represented itself inside organizations, has been kind of a gating factor for work for 50 years. And that's now all changing, right? And SDLC in a lot of contexts is now, it's not disappearing, but it is radically getting kind of turned on its ear. And I think that doesn't necessarily mean that business analysis has to become an expert at code architecture, but I do think it has to be, it can contribute immensely to the implications of the changes in code architecture and code work, as you see in a lot of settings right now. I think that's another classic example of where the skills themselves are probably not fundamentally different than they were a decade ago, but I'm calibrating them in a very different way, because I might be focused on strategic user acceptance instead of just running test cases, because I may be iterating that code many, many times inside my cycle now. And I've got to know that I'm getting to the right place. Or maybe on the input side, the specification architecture that's feeding those code tools, right, and giving me instant results now probably has a bit more of a spotlight on it too, because I have both opportunity and risk. I've got opportunity to do all kinds of scenario building that may allow me to get to a very good product very quickly. But I've got to know that those scenario, designs that I'm working on are the right ones. Are they serving a customer need? Are they serving a business process outcome? Are they serving whatever my organizational context needs them to?
Thank you.
That's what shows what good you.
Good coverage.
I mean, it makes me think though, on top of what you said, that, I think historically we would always think about the technology team and think about their skill set and think about, business analysts need to take on more of the technical skill set. But actually, maybe there's a perspective here that perhaps some of the business that we work with are naturally going to take on more of that technical skill set themselves. And they'll still need some of the BA supporting skill sets and perspectives to make sure that they're not running before they can walk, and to make sure that they're thinking about the wider solution and what it is they actually need, rather than using a term I use a lot, getting seduced by the solution.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that, again, this is a calibration of our historical skill set, probably. It also varies depending on the organization. In a lot of the tech kind of app-focused world, I think it's going to be a different answer than in the intensive sort of process-focused world, where you have software and application software, particularly in both of those worlds, but it's in a different way, right? The software is not a product in each of those settings. In some of those it is. And I think that will change how we bring the skills to bear too. Right?
Yeah, it's a really interesting dimension, because I mean, fortunately, through some of the IIBA events, some of the conferences, you get to meet other BAs that are not just focusing on financial services or tech solutions. Some of them are working on software that's maybe going to appear in an aeroplane, for example, or in a car. I think that feels like it can be a little bit more tangible to some degree, in that if you get it wrong, if you're designing the inner workings of an airplane,
there's risk there.
Very quickly disastrous.
Yes.
And hard to overcome. Some of that BA skill set, mindset might be a little different, to say.
And a lot of the promise of the newest technology is huge amounts of speed, lots of data crunched and sort of processed in a very short amount of time. So I guess the business analysis person being there just to check in on is that too quick? Sometimes is there extra checks and balances that need to be done throughout the process, particularly for those important cases where those could be quite impactful if there were errors or things that run through that information. And obviously also there's aspects, in Europe we have quite strict GDPR rules. There's lots of legality around data and things like that needs to be kind of considered. For example, so I mean, just an awareness of what needs to be checked on and looked at carefully.
I think what we've established over the few minutes roughly we've been talking is that business analysis is still very important, going to be important. How can we ensure that business analysis remains an accessible, inclusive career path across different industries and geographies?
Well, I mean, that's a lot of the work that we're involved in, right? So we are working internationally to nurture and grow a community of business analysis people who can be directly members as themselves, or directly members through their employer, or have found out about us through their learning journey, either sort of academia or training companies and things like that. And so I think what we're trying to maintain is a relevance, a place for people to come to and discuss ideas, hear perspectives that we've discussed before. And I think that's really kind of quite a lot of where my work, particularly day to day, impacts on the relevance of business analysis. Is the future is that there is a continued community of discussion, challenge, events, learning happening at all different levels, from the individual, the organisation, and then looking at this kind of spreading on a global kind of perspective as well. I think that's work I'm most involved in trying to support that for sure. I'm sure Delvin probably has a couple of ideas as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of elements in this, what we call ecosystem, but let me highlight maybe six of them really quickly. I think there's three areas that IIBA tries to work in to support the skills of the current and the future. One obviously is and then the second related to that, of course, is the certifications that act as the skill enablement and the skill uplift for practitioners and in the space. And really the third one that we are increasingly working on actively is becoming a digital home for contribution, for writing, for thinking. Some of it's sort of, long form things like books where we've tried to do a bit of work. Some of it is short form things like articles and ideas, graphs and checklists and things like that. And so our part of the curation work, I think, really focuses on those three areas and a bunch of others to support them. But I think in the community, there's also three really big foundational pieces. One is what Andy touched on, just the member community that is connecting with each other, that is talking, that is sharing ideas, that is figuring out ways to work together and learn from each other. And obviously connected to that one is the chapter constructs that we support globally around, particularly around some of the 40 largest countries where IIBA has some membership presence. And those two are very important together. And really the third one on the external ecosystem, if I call it that, is the partnerships that we work in. And there's sort of three main categories in there. One is in academia, where we work with, I think it's around 75 colleges and universities in various parts of the world, and we're looking to grow that are doing, some of it is just a skill uplift, some of it is embedding, more rigorous work inside degree programs or undergraduate programs or course level programs. The training community, with about 125 training partners globally who are working on that skill. Some of them are related to certification, some of them are just general areas of uplifting the skill contribution from a business analysis standpoint. And then the third one, which I think has about 300 partners in it today, is the corporate engagement with organizations that are using business analysis at scale. And we're trying to support that as best we can in various areas of kind of our contribution. But I think effectiveness in our future depends on all six of those and a lot of other things all working together. And we try to nurture and support all those elements to the best of our ability, but we're also not, as I said at the beginning, we're not the thought leader of how all of this evolves. What we're trying to be is the glue in the ecosystem that helps the pieces work together, builds the communication tools, nurtures the technology envelope, and those kind of things, and tries to act as a place for ideas to be shared and to be published and to be refined and to be tested and things like that.
Yeah, and I definitely vouch for the ability for the IIBA to be the glue that allows me, as an example, to interact with different people, different chapters, for different purposes. I wonder, are there any exciting new career paths you think they're opening up for people with the BA skill set? So the difference there being not necessarily business analysts, but people with BA skill set.
Well, that's another tough question, John. Well, I think we've touched on one, and I'm going to be intrigued to see how this evolves in the next few years, which is sort of the intersection between business analysis and prompt engineering. Because I think prompt engineering up until this point in the evolution of AI has been a very technical skill, because you needed a level of understanding of how large language models in particular are constructed and the underlying data architecture that's inside those models in order to do that really, really well. But that is, I think, going to evolve, because it's going to become more transparent and more automated and hopefully more reliable in terms of that work. And therefore, the technical skill of the construction of the prompt may start to change and become less critical in the future than it is now. But the business skill inside what I am prompting for is going to become, I think, even more important than it is today. And I think there may be an interesting world. I don't know if it's an exciting career path, but I've seen some incredibly talented business analysis practitioners in a bunch of different places in the world working in that space. And it's sort of, right now, it's sort of what am I trying to solve for from a business understanding or business solution or business challenge standpoint, and then how am I representing that into the vernacular of a prompt engineering architecture, right? And I think that would, I think there's business analysis skill that is naturally relevant there. Be interesting to see how that evolves over the next 2 years as a practice area.
Yes, yeah, it seems really interesting because I mean, Capco had we're in our second more advanced pilot of Gen AI, but certainly I recall the first one, and it really did call out that those BAs amongst the group probably had a bit of a head start, I think, in the way they were using Gen AI or ChatGPT as one example, because the way we tend to interact with and ask questions of our stakeholders or give them context sometimes to be able to answer a question was perfect for ChatGPT, because it could benefit from a bit more context. Whilst it can interpret a bad question, it's far easier to interpret a good question, or a series of good questions.
Yeah.
So, it definitely relates to what you were saying.
That's interesting because obviously in the prompt process, I'm not an expert on this, but I'm learning is that, given those prerequisite things you want to include in the question really helps enormously to get a closer answer to what you're really looking for. As you say, I think that's kind of duck to water for a business analyst to know what they want to include in the ingredients of what they want their answer to.
It was a business analyst as well that was responsible for getting the question and saying, what question should I have asked to get a better answer? And maybe, I'm not saying only BAs would put that in, but again, I think that BA mindset would probably encourage you to ask questions.
I think we're going to see some others too, and I don't think these are new, but we've got a couple of different things about you mentioned one earlier, just sort of the key hallucination. Right? How do we know that this is serious or not serious? Certain people say hallucination is normal. It's a big problem because of the quality of parents and hallucination. I think that's whatever I answer is there, probably some context. There's a real skill opportunity for business analysis. People say that's things that you thought. Also true. Data ethics. How do we know that the data set, that the model portfolio that we are using, which probably in the future is going to become more a set of models, not one model, right? It's taking a large language model in this context, doing some work with it, then feeding it into another one to finish or to test or to check, and then taking that and putting it into another one. And the model side of that is going to become probably more straightforward in the future than it is today. But the data architecture underneath it is going to become even more important. Do I have the right ethical data constructs in each of those 4 models that I'm using to render my result? Do I understand where the conflicts may be, right? Is there bias in this one that I have to pay attention to, right? And I think those are going to be really important areas where business analysis skill can be very relevant.
Yeah, definitely emphasises the importance of those BAs out there that haven't already recognised that data is very important. And something they can only, you can't get, it's definitely beneficial to develop your data and your business data skills. So I think it's only going to be more the case when AI and Gen AI relies on that foundation. So I think that's probably also my point. And then we sort of touched on as well generalists versus specialists. So perhaps we'll park on that one for a while. But maybe a nice question to sort of end my question in anyway is really, if you could rewrite the definition of business analysis for the future, what would it say? And to make this simple, I don't necessarily need the whole definition, but are there any key aspects that you would expect to see sat within that definition?
Another easy question, John, to wrap up on. Excuse me. I think there's a lot in certainly the IIBA working definition of business analysis. It's been around now for almost 2 decades, so it was iterated early on that I like. And I think it has more resiliency than maybe sometimes we realize. But I think if I were king of this thought process for a day, which I'm not, by any stretch of the imagination. And I was shifting it a little. I might be working on how do we really know that we are delivering value? How do we work on value? I mean, we have outcome as kind of a major theme in our work, always as a professional, which I think is really important and has not changed. And none of what we've been talking about is actually going to change that. But organizations at the end of the day are trying to, if they're doing their work well, they're trying to do something. They're doing their work at the best level they can. It's for mission, it's for customer, it's for stakeholder, or some combination of those things. And I think that if we are always passionately oriented toward the outcome, the value, the business context of our work, then we're going to be lined up well in terms of the organizations that we end up working with. Either we're doing that in a consultancy capacity, or whether we're on staff, or whether we're doing advisor work. I don't think what matters. Organizations fundamentally are trying to do something. There's a few that probably have some nefarious ideas there that maybe are a different conversation, but most of them are trying to serve a customer, serve a constituency, serve a product output of one kind or another. I think the more our work is aligned to that it's sort of ruthlessly measured by how we are helping get to good outcome, to meaningful value, to purposeful mission, then we're probably on the right track in the future.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that really resonates on the specifically on the point that as a BA, it's very difficult to deliver value. You can contribute to value because there's others that are also in that value chain, as it were, like developers and testers and those who deploy, etc. But maybe thinking about the value, as you pointed out, is a way for BAs to recognise that they are a contributor to that value stream, as well.
Yeah.
But also maybe it makes them recognise that there are other related professions outside of business analysis, such as business architecture, that they can also tap into and interact with to contribute to that value as well. So I really like that answer you gave as well.
Yeah, I think there's sometimes, I've heard debate at times about whether business analysis is really about, whether it can really deliver value. I mean, there's lots of ways to unpack that statement, but I think if you ask a leader, a CEO, or whoever a leader might be in a context, a good one, somebody who really understands the mission of their organization, that's really trying to work, and their answer is going to be absolutely. I need that from everybody inside my organization, and especially you who have some understanding and some skills of what we are trying to be about. I want you to be delivering value, but value means all kinds of different things. Value might just be, in this moment, ensuring that we have a solid understanding of what our stakeholders really need, or our customers, or whatever, right? I think there's many, many ways to unpack what value might mean in a particular context, but I think we should always be about value, and we should always be thinking, to your point, about where's the value here that I'm trying to contribute to? Because I also think there's one other implication too, which is I think we are well equipped to be the people who kind of put up our hands and say, I'm not sure we're getting value, or I'm not sure we're heading in a path that makes sense, or this seems to be a disconnect between what I'm working on and what we think we're about. Right? And I think when we can be the people who step into that and have kind of, the courage and the skill to put our hand up and go, let's just stop for a minute and look at a couple of things. And that's also part of what value ultimately means in organizations. So.
Yeah, great point. I mean, it makes me think as well, there's a lot of questions sometimes with situations where the value of business analysis is asked. And I think if you think more as a business analyst about the value, then you're proving the value of the business analysis as you go. And it's probably very easy in comparison to retrospectively explain the value you've added in that way, because you'll recall that. I think I was using value in that point too many times. Andy, any final thoughts from you?
I don't think I have a lot to add. I just the same idea, just to kind of have this clarity of thinking that the role is certainly extremely valuable moving forward. I'm just really interested to hear from the community. I think the business analysis professionals that I meet on a day-by-day basis are all very kind of opinionated and passionate about the value that they bring to a process. I'm really interested to hear about from people. So I look forward to meeting more people at events, at meetings on partnership points about these things, and encouraging them to come forward and contribute to that conversation.
Excellent. And Andy, for anyone watching this who is not familiar with the IIBA already, how can they find out more or get involved?
Well, certainly you can find my details via LinkedIn. I'm happy to share. I think you have my contact details to put those in the notes. I'm happy to talk to anyone to kind of point them in the direction of various aspects of IIBA's work. As I mentioned, I cover the European region, but I'm still on a fantastic team with colleagues pretty much on all different continents around the world. So if you're hearing this from somewhere that isn't within Europe, then I'm also able to point you in the right direction as well. So feel free to get in touch.
Bill, any final thoughts from you?
Well, thank you for this, John. It's been good to chat.
Yeah, likewise, Jens.
We really appreciate your work. Really appreciate doing this. It's a really smart example of how we broaden our ecosystem and learn from each other. There's a whole lot of different ways to do that. And I really appreciate what you do with your podcast. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. I think final thoughts I think from me is really just to probably build on what the two gents have said there, and maybe look within your own network. You probably know people already that are doing things with or for the IIBA, so maybe reach out to them and find out a little bit more through that channel. Or of course, IIBA.com or Andy directly as well. Thank you, gents, and thank you, everybody.